Hello, thank you for tuning in. My name is Unyimeabasi Udoh, and I'm going to be reading an essay by Chinua Achebe that was first published in 1998. It's called Africa's Tarnished Name. It is a great irony of history and geography that Africa, whose landmass is closer than any other to the mainland of Europe, should come to occupy in the European psychological disposition the farthest point of otherness, should indeed become Europe's very antithesis. The French African poet and statesman Leopold Sédar Senghor, in full awareness of this paradox, chose to celebrate that problematic proximity in a poem, Prayer to Masks, with the startling imagery of one of nature's most profound instances of closeness, joined together at the navel. And why not? After all, the shores of northern Africa and southern Europe enclose, like two cupped hands, the waters of the world's most famous sea, perceived by the ancients as the very heart and center of the world. Senghor's metaphor would have been better appreciated in the days of ancient Egypt and Greece than today. History aside, geography has its own brand of lesson in the paradox of proximity for us. This lesson, which was probably lost on everyone else except those of us living in West Africa in the last days of the British Raj, was the ridiculous fact of longitudinal equality between London, mighty imperial metropolis, and Accra, rude rebel camp of colonial insurrection, so that, their unequal stations in life notwithstanding, they were named by the same Greenwich meridian and consequently doomed together to the same time of day. But longitude is only half the story. There is also latitude, and latitude gives London and Accra very different experiences of midday temperature, for example, and perhaps gave their inhabitants over past aeons of time radically different complexions. So differences are there, if those are what one is looking for. But there is no way in which such differences as do exist could satisfactorily explain the profound perception of alienness which Africa has come to represent for Europe. This perception problem is not in its origin the result of ignorance, as we are sometimes inclined to think. At least, it is not ignorance entirely, or even primarily. It was in general a deliberate invention devised to facilitate two gigantic historical events: the Atlantic slave trade and the colonization of Africa by Europe, the second event following closely on the heels of the first, and the two stretching together across almost half a millennium from about 1500 AD. In an important and authoritative study of this invention, two American scholars, Dorothy Hammond and Alta Jablow, show how dramatic change in the content of British writing about Africa coincided with an increase in the volume of the slave trade to its highest level in the 18th century. That content, quote, shifted from almost indifferent and matter-of-fact reports of what the voyagers had seen to judgmental evaluation of the Africans. The shift to such pejorative comment was due in large measure to the effects of the slave trade. A vested interest in the slave trade produced a literature of devaluation, and since the slave trade was under attack, the most derogatory writing about Africa came from its literary defenders. Scottish slave trader Archibald Dalzell, for instance, prefaced his work, The History of Dahomey, with an apology for slavery. Quote, "Whatever evils the slave trade may be attended with, it is mercy to poor wretches who would otherwise suffer from the butcher's knife." End quote. Numerous pro-slavery tracts appeared, all intent upon showing the immorality and degradation of Africans. Enslavement of such a degraded people was thus not only justifiable, but even desirable. The character of Africans could change only for the better through contact with their European masters. Slavery, in effect, became the means of the African salvation, for it introduced them to Christianity and civilization. End quote. The vast arsenal of derogatory images of Africa amassed to defend the slave trade and, later, colonization, gave the world a literary tradition that is now happily defunct, but also a particular way of looking, or rather, not looking, at Africa and Africans that endures, alas, into our own day. And so, although those sensational African novels, which were so popular in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, have trickled to a virtual stop, their centuries-old obsession with lurid and degrading stereotypes of Africa has been bequeathed to the cinema, to journalism, to certain varieties of anthropology, even to humanitarianism and missionary work itself. A few years ago, there was an extraordinary program on television about the children of the major Nazi war criminals, whose lives had been devastated by the burden of the guilt of their fathers. I remember how I felt quite sorry for them in the beginning. But then, out of nowhere, came the information that one of them had gone into the church and would go as a missionary to the Congo. I sat up. What has the Congo got to do with it? I asked my television screen. Then I remembered the motley parade of adventurers, of saints and sinners, that had been drawn from Europe to that region since it was first discovered by Europe in 1482. Franciscan monks, Jesuit priests, envoys from the King of Portugal, explorers and missionaries, agents of King Leopold of the Belgians, H.M. Stanley, Roger Casement, Joseph Conrad, Albert Schweitzer, ivory hunters and rubber merchants, slave traders, and humanitarians. They all made their visit and left their mark, for good or ill. And the Congo, like the ancient tree by the much-used farm road, bears on its bark countless scars of the machete. Paradoxically, a saint like Schweitzer can give one a lot more trouble than a King Leopold II, villain of unmitigated guilt, because along with doing good and saving African lives, Schweitzer also managed to announce that the African was indeed his brother, but only his junior brother. But of all the hundreds and thousands of European visitors to the Congo region in the last 500 years, there were a few who had the deftness and sleight of hand of Joseph Conrad, or who left as deep a signature on that roadside tree. In his Congo novella, Heart of Darkness, Conrad managed to transform elements from centuries of transparently crude and fanciful writing about Africans into a piece of serious and permanent literature. Halfway through his story, Conrad describes the journey up the River Congo in the 1890s as though it were the very first encounter between conscious humanity, coming from Europe, and an unconscious, primeval hegemony that had apparently gone nowhere and seen nobody since the world was created. Naturally, it is the conscious party which tells the story. Quote, "We were wanderers on a prehistoric Earth, on the Earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. We could have fancied ourselves the first of men taking possession of an accursed inheritance." End quote. Prehistoric Earth, unknown planet, fancied ourselves the first of men. This passage, which is Conrad at his best, or his worst, according to the reader's predilection, goes on at some length through a burst of yells, a whirl of black limbs, of hands clapping, feet stamping, body swaying, eyes rolling, black incomprehensible frenzy, the prehistoric man himself, the knight of first ages, and then Conrad delivers his famous coup de grace. Were these creatures really human? And he answers the question with the most sophisticated ambivalence of double negatives. Quote, "No, they were not inhuman. Well, you know that was the worst of it, the suspicion of their not being inhuman." End quote. But to return to the word fancied, which Conrad's genius had lit upon, quote, "We could have fancied ourselves the first of men taking possession of an accursed inheritance," end quote. I suggest that fancied is the alarm word insinuated into Conrad's dangerously highfalutin delirium by his genius as well as simple reason and sanity, but almost immediately crowded out, alas, by the emotional and psychological spell cast on him by the long-established and well-heeled tradition of writing about Africa. Conrad was at once a prisoner of this tradition and its most influential promoter, for he, more than anyone else, secured its admission into the Hall of Fame of canonical literature. Fancy, sometimes called imagination, is not inimical to fiction. On the contrary, they are bosom friends. But they also observe careful protocol around each other's property and around the homestead of their droll and difficult neighbor, fact. Conrad was a writer who kept much of his fiction fairly close to the facts of his life as a sailor. He had no obligation to do so, but that was what he chose to do, to write about places that actually exist and about people who live in them. He confessed in his 1917 author's note that, quote, "Heart of Darkness is experienced too, but his experience pushed a little, and only very little, beyond the actual facts of the case for the perfectly legitimate, I believe, purpose of bringing it home to the minds and bosoms of the readers." End quote. One fact of the case which Conrad may not have known was how much traffic the River Congo had already seen before it saw him in the 1890s. Even if one discounts the Africans who lived on its banks, there had been many Europeans on the river before Conrad. There was a European sailing ship on the Congo 400 years before he made his journey, and fancied himself the first of men to do it. That degree of fancy needs a good dose of fact to go with it. The Portuguese captain, Diogo Cao, who discovered the river for Europe in 1482, was actually looking for something else when he stumbled on it. He was looking for a passage around Africa into the Indian Ocean. On his second voyage, he went beyond his first stop, up the river, and heard from the inhabitants of the area about a powerful ruler whose capital was still farther up. Cao left 4 Franciscan monks to study the situation and resume the primary purpose of his expedition. On his way back, he once more detoured into the Congo to pick up his monks, but they were gone. He seized, in retaliation, a number of African hostages, carried them off to Lisbon, and delivered them to King Manuel of Portugal. This unpropitious beginning of Europe's adventure in the heart of Africa was quickly mended when Cao returned to the Congo for the third time in 1487, bringing back his African hostages, who had meanwhile learned the Portuguese language and Christian religion. Cao was taken to the king, the Mwene Congo, seated on an ivory throne surrounded by his courtiers. Cao's monks were returned to him, and all was well. An extraordinary period ensued in which the king of Congo became a Christian with the title of Dom Alfonso I. Before very long, quote, the royal brothers of Portugal and Congo were writing letters to each other that were couched in terms of complete equality of status. Emissaries went back and forth between them. Relations were established between Mbanza and the Vatican. A son of the Mwene Congo was appointed in Rome itself as bishop of his country. End quote. This bishop, Dom Enrique, had studied in Lisbon, and when he led a delegation of Congo noblemen to Rome for his consecration, he addressed the Pope in Latin. Nzinga Mbema, baptized as Dom Alfonso, was a truly extraordinary man. I have written of him elsewhere, but want to emphasize that he learned in middle life to read and speak Portuguese. It was said that when he examined the legal code of Portugal, he was surprised by its excessive harshness. In jest, he asked the Portuguese envoy what the penalty was in his country for a citizen who dared put his foot on the ground. This criticism was probably reported back to the King of Portugal, for in a 1511 letter to his royal brother, Dom Alfonso, he made defensive reference to differing nations of severity between their two nations. Can we today imagine a situation in which an African ruler is giving, rather than receiving, admonition on law and civilization? The Christian kingdom of Dom Alfonso I in Congo did not fare well and was finally destroyed 2 centuries later after a long and protracted struggle with the Portuguese. A major source of the problem was the determination of the Portuguese to take out of Congo as many of the slaves as their vast new colony in Brazil demanded, and the Congo king's desire to limit or end the traffic. There was also a dispute over mining rights. In the war that finally ended the independence of the Kingdom of Congo and established Portuguese control over it, both armies of both nations marched under Christian banners. If this story reads as a fairy tale, that is not because it did not happen, but because we have become all too familiar with the Africa created by Conrad's Heart of Darkness, its long line of predecessors going back to the 16th century, and successors today in print and the electronic media. This tradition has invented an Africa where nothing good happens or ever happened, an Africa that has not been discovered yet and is waiting for the first European visitor to explore it and explain it and straighten it up, or, more likely, perish in the attempt. In Conrad's boyhood, explorers were the equivalent of today's Hollywood superstars. As a child of 9, Conrad had pointed at the center of Africa on a map and said, "When I grow up, I shall go there." Among his heroes were Mungo Park, who drowned exploring the river Niger, David Livingstone, who died looking for the source of the Nile, Dr. Barth, the first white man to approach the gates of the walled city of Kano. Conrad tells a memory story of Barth, quote, approaching Kano, which no European eye had seen till then, end quote, and an excited population of Africans screaming out of the gates to, quote, behold the wonder, end quote. And Conrad also tells us how much better he liked Dr. Barth's first white man story than the account of Sir Hugh Clifford, British governor of Nigeria, traveling in state to open a college in Kano 40 years later. Even though Conrad and Hugh Clifford were friends, the story and pictures of the second Kano event left Conrad, quote, without any particular relation. Education is a great thing, but Dr. Barth gets in the way, end quote. That is neatly and honestly put. The Africa of colleges is understandably of little interest to avid lovers of unexplored Africa. In one of his last essays, Geography and Some Explorers, Conrad describes the explorers he admired as, quote, fathers of military geography, end quote, or even more reverentially as the, quote, blessed of militant geography, end quote. Too late on the scene to himself to join their ranks, did he merely become a militant conjurer of geography and history? Let it be said right away that it is not a crime to prefer the Africa of explorers to the Africa of colleges. There were some good people who did. When I was a young radio producer in Lagos in the early 1960s, a legendary figure from the first decade of British colonial rule in Nigeria returned for a final visit in her 80s. Sylvia Lyth Ross had made a very important study of Igbo women in her pioneering work, African Women, in which she established from masses of personal interviews of Igbo women that they did not fit European stereotypes of downtrodden slaves and beasts of burden. She graciously agreed to do a radio program for me about Nigeria at the turn of the 20th century. It was a wonderful program. What has stuck in my mind was when she conceded that the many good new things in the country, like Ibadan University College, and asked wistfully, but where is my beloved bush? Was this the same hankering for the exotic which lay behind Conrad's preference for a lone European explorer over African education? I could hear a difference in tone. Sylvia Lyth Ross was gentle, almost self-mocking in her choice, and without the slightest hint of hostility. At worst, you might call her a starry-eyed conservationist. Conrad is different. At best, you are uncertain about the meaning of his choice. Until, that is, you encounter his portrait in Heart of Darkness, of an African who has received the rudiments of education. Quote, and between whiles I had to look after the savage who was fireman. He was an improved specimen. He could fire up a vertical boiler. He was there below me, and, upon my word, to look at him was as edifying as seeing a dog in a parody of breeches and a feather hat walking on his hind legs. A few months of training had done for that really fine chap. He squinted at the steam gauge and the water gauge with an evident effort of intrepidity, and he had filed teeth, too, the poor devil, and the wool of his patch shaved into queer patterns, and 3 ornamental scars on each of his cheeks. He ought to have been clapping his hands and stamping his feet on the bank, instead of which he was hard at work, a thrall to strange witchcraft, full of improving knowledge. End quote. This is poisonous writing, in full consonance with the tenets of the slave trade, inspired tradition of European portrayal of Africa. There are endless variations in that tradition of the problem of education for Africa. For example, a highly educated African might be shown fluffing up his veneer of civilization along with his Oxford blazer when the tom-toms begin to beat. The moral, African education do not mix. Or, Africa will revert to type. And what is this type? Something dark and ominous and different. At the center of all the problems Europe has had in its perception of Africa lies a simple question of African humanity. Are they or are they not like us? Conrad devised a simple hierarchical order of souls for the characters in Heart of Darkness. At the bottom are the Africans, whom he calls rudimentary souls. Above them are the defective Europeans, obsessed with ivory, petty, vicious, morally obtuse. He calls them tainted souls or small souls. At the top are regular Europeans, and their souls don't seem to have the need for an adjective. The gauge for measuring a soul turns out to be the evil character, Mr. Kurtz. Quote, he had the power to charm or frighten rudimentary souls into an aggravated witch dance in his honor. He could also fill the small souls of the pilgrims with bitter misgivings. He had one devoted friend at least, and he had conquered one soul in the world that was neither rudimentary nor tainted with self-seeking. End quote. The alleged tendency of Africans to offer worship to any European who comes along is another favorite theme in European writing about Africa. Variations on it include the veneration by Africans of an empty Coca-Cola bottle that falls out of an airplane. Even children's stories are not free of this insult, as I once learned from foolishly buying an expensive, colorful book for my little girl without first checking it out. The aggravated witch dance for a mad white man by hordes of African natives may accord with the needs and desires of the fabulous of the Africa that never was, but the experience of Congo was different. Far from falling over themselves to worship their invaders, the people of this region of Africa have a long history of resistance to European control. In 1687, an exasperated Italian priest, Father Cavazzi, complained, quote, "These nations think themselves the foremost men in the world. They imagine that Africa is not only the greatest part of the world, but also the happiest and most agreeable. Their king is persuaded that there is no other monarch in the world who is his equal." End quote. Between Father Cavazzi's words and Joseph Conrad's images of gyrating and babbling savages, there was indeed a hiatus of 2 harsh centuries. But that would not explain the difference. People are wrong when they tell you that Conrad was on the side of Africans because his story showed great compassion towards them. Africans are not really served by his compassion, whatever it means. They ask for one thing alone, to be seen for what they are, human beings. Conrad pulls back from granting them this favor in Heart of Darkness. Apparently, some people can read it without seeing any problem. We simply have to be patient. But a word may be in order for those last-ditch defenders who fall back on the excuse that the racial insensitivity of Conrad was normal in his time. Even if that were so, it would still be a flaw in a serious writer, a flaw which responsible criticism today could not gloss over. But it is not even true that everybody in Conrad's day was like him. David Livingstone, an older contemporary and by no means a saint, was different. Ironically, he was also Conrad's great hero, whom he placed, quote, among the blessed of militant geography, a notable European figure and the most venerated perhaps of all the objects of my early geographical enthusiasm, end quote. And yet his hero's wise, inclusive humanity eluded Conrad. What did he think of Livingstone's famous judgment of Africans? Quote, "I have found it difficult to come to a conclusion on their, Africans' character. They sometimes perform actions remarkably good, and sometimes strangely the opposite. After long observation, I came to the conclusion that they are just as strange a mixture of good and evil as men are everywhere else." End quote. Joseph Conrad was 44 years younger than David Livingstone. If his times were responsible for his racial attitude, we should expect him to be more advanced than Livingstone, not more backward. Without doubt, the times in which we live influence our behavior, but the best or merely the better among us, like Livingstone, are never held hostage by their times. An interesting analogy may be drawn here with the visual arts imagery of Africans in 18th century Britain. I refer to a 1997 exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in London on the subject of Ignatius Sancho, an 18th century African man of letters, and his contemporaries. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the famous painting of Ignatius Sancho by Thomas Gainsborough in 1786. The art historian Rayhan King describes the painting in these words, quote, "Gainsborough's skill is clearest in his treatment of Sancho's skin color. Unlike Hogarth, whose use of violet pigments when painting black faces results in a grayish skin tone, the brick red of Sancho's waistcoat in Gainsborough's portrait, combined with the rich brown background in Sancho's own skin color, makes the painting unusually warm in tone as well as feeling. Gainsborough has painted thinly over a reddish base with a shading in a chocolate tone and minimal colder lights on Sancho's nose, chin, and lips. The resulting face seems to glow and contrast strongly with the vanishing effect so often suffered by the faces of black servants in the shadows of 18th century portraits of their masters." End quote. Evidently, Gainsborough put care and respect into his painting, and he produced a magnificent portrait of an African who had been born on the slave ship and, at the time of his sitting, was still a servant in an English aristocratic household. But neither of these facts was allowed to take away from his human dignity in Gainsborough's portrait. There were other portraits of Africans in Britain painted at the same time. One of them proves a study in contrast with Gainsborough's rendering of Ignatius Sancho. The African portrayed in this other picture was one Francis Williams, a graduate of Cambridge, a poet, and the founder of a school in Jamaica, an amazing phenomenon in those days. A portrait of Williams by an anonymous artist shows a man with a big, flat face lacking any distinctiveness, standing in a cluttered library on tiny broomstick legs. It was clearly an exercise in mockery. Perhaps Francis Williams aroused resentment because of his rare accomplishments. Certainly the anonymous scarecrow portrait was intended to put him in his place, in much the same way as philosopher David Hume was said to have dismissed Williams' accomplishments by comparing the admiration people had for him to the praise they might give, quote, a parrot who speaks a few words plainly, end quote. It is clear, then, that 18th century Britain, there were Britons, like the painter Gainsborough, who were ready to accord respect to an African, even an African who was a servant, and there were other Britons, like the anonymous painter of Francis Williams, or the eminent philosopher Hume, who would sneer at a black man's achievement. And it was not so much a question of the times in which they lived as the kind of people they were. It was the same in the times of Joseph Conrad a century later, and it is the same today. Things have not gone well in Africa for quite a while. The era of colonial freedom, which began so optimistically with Ghana in 1957, would soon be captured by Cold War manipulators and skewed into a deadly season of ostensible ideological conflicts, which encouraged the emergence of all kinds of evil rulers, able to count on limitless supplies of military hardware from their overseas patrons, no matter how atrociously they ruled their peoples. With the sudden end of the Cold War, these rulers or their successor regimes lost their value to their sponsors and were cast on the rubbish heap and forgotten, along with their nations. Disaster parades today with impunity through the length and breadth of much of Africa. War, genocide, military and civilian dictatorships, corruption, collapsed economies, poverty, disease, and every ill attendant upon political and social chaos. It is necessary for these sad conditions to be reported, because evil thrives best in quiet, untidy corners. In many African countries, however, the local news media cannot report these events without unleashing serious and even deadly consequences. And so the foreign correspondent is frequently the only means of getting an important story told, or of drawing the world's attention to disasters in the making or being covered up. Such an important role is risky in more ways than one. It can expose the correspondent to actual physical danger, but there is also the moral danger of indulging in sensationalism and dehumanizing the sufferer. This danger immediately raises the question of the character and attitude of the correspondent, because the same qualities of mind which in the past separated a Conrad from a Livingston, or a Gainsborough from an anonymous painter of Francis Williams, are still present and active in the world today. Perhaps this difference can best be put in one phrase: the presence or absence of respect for the human person. In the 1997 calendar issued by Amnesty International USA in a joint effort with the International Center of Photography, a brief but important editorial message criticizes some current journalistic practices. Quote, "The apocalyptic vision of the newsmakers does not accurately document the world community, nor are they particularly helpful in forming a picture of our common humanity." End quote. And the text goes on to set down the principles which guided the selection of the 12 photographs in the calendar as follows, quote, "They document an authentic humanity. They also communicate the fact that every person, everywhere, possesses an inalienable rightness and an imperishable dignity, two qualities that must be respected and protected." End quote. There is a documentary film which I have seen more than once on PBS, which is not troubled by Amnesty's concern. It is about sex and reproduction through the entire range of living things, from the simplest single-cell creatures in the water to complex organisms like fishes and birds and mammals. It is a very skillful, scientific production that pulls no punches with respect to where babies come from. It is there in all its starkness. Was it necessary to conclude this graphic reproductive odyssey with man, or rather woman? I did not think so. The point had already been made more than well enough with apes, including, I believe, those that invented the missionary position. But the producers of the documentary were quite uncompromising in their exhaustiveness. And so a woman in labor was exposed to show the baby coming out of her. But the real shock for me was that everyone in that labor room was white, except the Ghanaian, by her accent, mother in childbirth. Why were all the rest white, you may ask? Because this was all happening in a hospital in London, not in Accra. I am sure that the producers of the program would reject with indignation any suggestion that their choice of candidate was influenced in any way by race. And they might even be right to the extent that they would not have had a meeting of their production team to decide that a white woman would not be an appropriate subject. But then, such deliberations do not happen, except perhaps in the crude caucuses of the lunatic fringe. Race is no longer a visible presence in the boardroom, but but it may lie unseen in our subconscious. The lesson for that production team, for those who broadcast their product, and for the rest of us, is that when we are comfortable and inattentive, we run the risk of committing grave injustices absentmindedly. Thank you for listening. I hope you stay tuned to the rest of the readers. Have a great summer solstice.